Hi guys, Sean here from digiDirect. Now today we're going to be chatting about the Sony 100mm f2.8 STF G Master lens. Now this is the newest in the G Master lineup from Sony. There's been 3 lenses previously out in this lineup, the 24-70 2.8, 85mm 1.4, and 70-200 2.8 lenses. Now the G Master lineup is kind of your premium high-end E-mount full-frame lenses from Sony. Of course though, they will still work as well on crop sensor cameras like the a6500. However, this 100mm is a little bit different from the other G Masters, and most of that difference comes from the Apd element that's inside the lens. This is going to have a big effect on the bokeh of the lens, as well as the light transmission. Now we'll get to all that in just a sec, but let's start by taking a look at the build of the lens. So when we look at the lens here, the first thing that we can see is it's actually not too big of a lens, which is good. It does, of course, have a manual focus ring on the front. To my touch, it's actually a little bit loose. I wish there was a little bit more resistant and dampening on this ring. For focusing for video, it just feels a little bit too loose for me, more so than what would be comfortable. We do have a nice manual aperture ring here around the side, which is great. At the bottom here, we have this toggle ring, which switches between close focusing and far away focusing. But the weird thing here is that they don't have an option that covers the entire focus range. So if you're focusing on something close up and then you change the focus on something far away, you have to remember to change that ring manually on the lens, otherwise it won't focus. That's a little bit annoying. I wish they had a third option that just covered the entire range, so if you didn't want to have to think about that, you could just leave it in there. On the side here, we have an autofocus manual focus switch, as well as a switch to turn on and off the optical steady shot. So that means that, this lens has image stabilization in it, which is great. That'll sync up with in-body image stabilization that you might have on your A7 camera as well. It's good to see that on this lens. The only other G Master that has that is the 70-200. We see on this lens, it'll be particularly useful in combating the decreased light transmission that this lens has from that Apd element. We'll touch on that in just a sec. There's also a focus hold button on the side here, and on the other side, we even have this switch that lets us toggle the aperture ring between a clicked or stepped ring and a smooth clickless ring. Now, this is a really nice feature. Most lenses don't have this. To be able to change it to a clickless ring was really good for video because it lets you do aperture pulls to change the exposure as you move between 2 areas of different exposure in the same shot. That's really, really useful. Although it does make me wish that the manual focus ring was a little bit nicer for video since we have that nice aperture ring as well. So let's touch on the most unique aspect of this lens, and that's definitely the Apd element, which is inside the lens. So this acts like a filter. It's an element that actually gets darker towards the edges, and what it does is affects the quality of the bokeh. And it gives the bokeh in the background a really nice, smooth, regular, and almost kind of perfect looking look to it. It makes it a very consistent fall off around the edges. So if you're on a quest for the most perfect, regular, consistent looking bokeh quality, this lens absolutely delivers that. The trade-off here is that the Apd element reduces the amount of light transmission getting into the lens. It acts almost like a bit of an ND filter inside the lens. And that's the reason why, although it's an f2.8 lens, it has an f-stop of 2.8, it has a t-stop of 5.6. And in fact, the t-stop is actually what's listed on the manual aperture ring here. So when shooting at the maximum aperture, it will have a shallow depth of field as if it was a 2.8 lens, which is good, but the light transmission coming through will be as if it was a 5.6 lens. So you're gonna have less light coming through to this lens, which means it's not gonna be as good in low light conditions. You're gonna have to boost your ISO higher to get the same shots that you might be able to get on a much lower ISO with a lens that does not have this Apd element. Now, if you're shooting a lot of times in controlled lighting situations, maybe you're a portrait photographer and you're often shooting with flashes set up and so on, this probably is not going to bother you too much because you won't be, having an issue in getting enough light. But if you're often shooting in run and gun in darker situations where you don't have a lot of control over the lighting, this might be something that you definitely need to be aware of on this lens. And that's why having the image stabilization on the lens is very important, because that doesn't negate it, but it helps to address the lower light transmission on this lens, because we can now shoot at a lower shutter speed because of that image stabilization. So that's good. I'm glad they included that on there, but it is something that you're going to want to consider, the trade-off of bokeh quality versus lower light transmission on this lens. Other than that Apd element, in terms of the overall image quality of the lens, it's very high. It's what we would expect from a lens that has that premium G Master label that only select few high-quality Sony lenses have. It's a very sharp lens. It looks very, very nice. Obviously, as I've mentioned, the bokeh looks beautiful. So that's very, very good. I think everyone is going to be very pleased in terms of sharpness, image quality coming out of the lens. In terms of video, the lens performs quite well. The Apd element that gives us the nice bokeh look for photos definitely translates into video as well, because it's a nice cinematic look, a very nice shallow depth of field in the background there. Also having that ability to have a clickless aperture ring is excellent. It allows us to do aperture pulls so we can go between darker and lighter areas in the same shot and adjust the aperture in the middle of the shot to have it be a smooth transition, which is a very nice feature to have. Again, I still do wish that the manual focus ring was a little bit more damped. I wish it did have a bit more resistance to it for manual focusing in video. But other than that, the video performance of this lens is good. So the 100mm G Master lens is definitely a very niche and unique lens. It's really going to come down to that APD element, which is going to make or break the lens for different people. If you're shooting often in controlled lighting or outdoors where there's a lot of light, maybe a studio as well where you've got flashes set up and so on, you're probably going to appreciate the inclusion of that APD element because it gives you that really nice bokeh look, a very consistent look in the bokeh, which is hard to achieve otherwise. Or you might not really appreciate that bokeh look that much, and you don't like the decreased light transmission that this lens has as a result of that. Now either way though, I think it's cool that Sony put this lens out. There's not a lot of lenses like this on the market. Laowa make one, and Fujifilm does have an APD version of their 56mm lens, but it's much more subtle than on this lens. It's not nearly as strong as on this 100mm G Master. So it's nice to have that option if it's something that does interest you. And if you do fall into the camp who likes it, the strong image quality coming out of this lens is definitely another big positive for the lens. Now, if you'd like to try out the Sony 100mm G Master lens and see what that bokeh looks like, come into one of our stores, you can test it out. We've got stores in the Sydney CBD, Bondi Junction, Miranda, Chatswood, the Brisbane and Melbourne CBD, and Kennington, Western Australia. You can also order the Sony 100mm G Master on our website at www.digidirect.com.au. Thanks guys, take care.